Great. Well, welcome everybody. I'm John Schultz. I'm the interim director of the Roper Center, and thanks for joining us. So many people are joining us virtually today. That's wonderful. And I know that for many of you, Jamie Druckman, today's speaker, needs no introduction, but it's really my honor to give him one anyway. Jamie is the Payson S. Wild Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University, and his record of scholarship is vast, and really that's probably an understatement, if anything. He's been at the forefront of research on so many crucial political and social science topics over the last decade or two, from his seminal work on framing, his theorizing about motivated reasoning that challenges conventional wisdom, to his recent efforts to understand public responses to the pandemic through his efforts with the COVID States Project. But many of you also know just what a generous person that Jamie is, not just by sharing his ideas with us, but by creating opportunities for other scholars to grow and succeed through opportunities like TESS, time-sharing experiments for the social sciences, which Jamie co-leads. We're really so thrilled to have him here with us today at the Roper Center and at Cornell to share his recent research. Please join me in welcoming Jamie Druckman.
Oh, well, thank you very much, John, for the overly generous introduction, and thank you so much for having me. It's really a great privilege to be here to present, especially in this 75th anniversary of Roper. And so I actually thought I would begin the talk by talking a little bit briefly about some of the history of Roper and Cornell, and kind of because it actually kind of situates my talk and what I'm going to speak about, because of the type of methods that I'm going to be using were really pioneered by people involved with Roper and Cornell. So if you just bear with me for a few slides, and then I'll actually begin my talk. And so, I think it is not. Oh, all right, great. So I'll first talk about the Roper Center, and as many of you might know, the Roper Center, Elmo Roper himself was really the first person to use national samples, and he directed the Fortune Survey, which was the first national sample polling, and he did this for many years, and that was kind of the basis, I believe, of the Roper Center beginning of the archive in 1947 when he donated that data, and it was the first social science data archive. And so I'm going to come back to using national samples. And one of the things that is really fascinating to me is open science, which we're all kind of quite familiar with, because a lot of social scientists think in 2010 they discovered this idea of open science. But of course, this goes back to the 18th century and beginning of scientific journals. But in kind of the current rendition of open science, the real focus has been on reproducibility and evaluation. And of course, that's something Roper had been doing for 75 years now and advocating for it. And one example is John mentioned my involvement in time-sharing experiments in the social sciences. And we had not archived any of our data, which it's now a 21-year-old project. And last time I visited Cornell in 2019, I'm just talking to Peter, and Peter's like, oh, you should archive your data with Roper. And now it is basically all archived with Roper and gotten a lot of usage, I believe, and people have been reanalyzing it, which of course has created a lot of work for us, because then we get questions about missing data and things, but that's okay. that's kind of the point, right? And so turning to Cornell, this is thanks to Kathleen's research, right? The APOR conference, I think it was the 4th APOR conference, was in Ithaca, and there was a quote in the presidential speech that Cornell University was a pioneer in the application of the survey method of obtaining data. So Pete sent along this, the beautiful history that you wrote. And then we can turn, Cornell is always kind of, there's a political scientists in the room would certainly know the book Voting, which was one of the seminal foundational books in political science by Berelson Lazarsfeld. And it was a study of the 1948 election. And there's a quote on page 6, which always stuck with me because I have a long connection with Cornell. And why did they choose Elmira, which is where the study took place? And they say the main criteria by which the town Elmira was, and they list a few reasons, and they say reasonable accessibility from Cornell University, which conducted a further study of the community. And of course, there was the Elmira Community Center study, which was the first, my understanding is that it was the first wave of the study which was done by Philip McCarthy, who was a Cornell statistician and ILL faculty, and John Dean, who's a Cornell sociologist, who was also one of the authors of one of the chapters in voting. If you look at the small type, I think it's around chapter 4 or so. But the really innovation of this study, which will come back to what we do, is they actually did a 4-wave panel study of during the campaign. I think it began in June and went through the campaign in 1948 and discovered some very fascinating dynamics in that very surprising campaign, because this, of course, was the Truman-Dewey election where the Chicago Tribune said Dewey had won, and of course he had not. So I'll come back to that because the data I'm going to be talking about is also a panel data. And then finally, Cornell in political science, this is some history that I just recently discovered myself. So as a political scientist, we always think of the founding of political science as going to 1880, and Columbia founded, Burgess founded the first political science department. But I discovered that actually in 1868, Cornell founded a department of history and political science. So they actually, as far as I know, may have been the first school that actually had political science in the title. And then, of course, today within the new School of Public Policy, there's the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. And I was reading about their campaign for the future of democracy, and that's really the focus of my talk. And so I'll finally turn to my talk, but I wanted to foreground a little bit in some of the kind of the history around the 75th anniversary and activities going on here. Because what you're going to see is that I'm using a national sample panel design, which happens to also have 4 waves as voting did. And the real focus is to assess the state of American democracy. And so it really resonates with a lot of these themes that you find in the history going back 70 or more years. And so the talk that I'm giving is part of a larger project. The title is Affective Polarization in America, When It Matters Politically and What It Means for Democracy. And it's a collaborative project with 4 others, Samara, Claire, Yana Kupnikov, Matt Lewandowski, and John Ryan. And I'm going to go, you thought I kind of was done with history, but I'm going to go even further back in history now. And I'm going to go back to the foundings. And so let me just kind of talk about the motivation and kind of debates around the things that motivate the larger project. Right, we can go back to the Federalist Papers, and as most of you are probably aware, they talk a lot about the dangers of factions and the factions pursuing their self-interest ahead of the nations. And then there's this great quote from George Washington's farewell address when he decided he would not serve a 3rd term as president. And it's unfortunately quite a prophetic quote, right? He said he was very worried about parties forming, and he said a party kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasional riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which basically describes the 2016 and 2020 elections, right? We have foreign influence with Russia, we have an insurrection, we have lots of animosity. And so he was saying this in 1796. So the really interesting thing then is to kind of go through the history of political science and how they thought about parties. Right? So we had that at the beginning. Then you go to kind of mid-century, we jump forward a couple hundred years, right? So we go to mid-century in contemporary political science. And by the 1950s, 1940s and 50s, political scientists at least had completely flipped to the other direction, right? So you had a quote from the famous political scientist, Schneider said, modern democracy is unthinkable save in terms of parties. So quite a different tune. You had a very famous 1950 American Political Science Association report talking about how we need to really strengthen political parties. At the turn of the century, so in about 2000, we had, this was kind of the scholarly consensus on contemporary American political parties, and the electorate centers on party decline, okay? So we had really concerned about parties. Now we're lamenting that we don't have strong parties. Now let's fast forward 20 years. Okay, we have this, and this was a policy forum that I was a part of in science. And right, we've completely gone in the other direction, right? Political sectarianism in America, a poisonous cocktail of othering, aversion, and moralization poses a threat to democracy. So we have this constant flipping around, right? And I'm going to come back to this at the end to kind of talk about the implications of what we do for these kind of portrayals. And if you look at recent book titles, Why We're Polarized, these are popular books. Political Tribes, Divided We Fall, Demagogy and Democracy, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, and so on and so forth. If you do a Google search on affective polarization, which is a term that has some history, but really was reintroduced in 2012, so it's a 10-year-old term, and there are over 2,500 articles that mention the term affective polarization. So it's really captured the interest of a lot of social scientists. So what is it? Okay, so what's affective polarization? In the most simple terms, it's basically something like a thermometer rating, where you ask respondents to how they would rate the political parties, so the Democrats or the Republicans, on a thermometer where 0 is very cold and 100 is very warm. And so the real interest is how do you rate your party and how do you rate the other party? And if we look at that trend over time, and so you can see, I'll just point. So the top line is where people rate their in-party. You can see that's been very flat since the mid-1970s when they started the time series of this in the American National Election Study. But if you look at the out-party rating, you see it was around 50 in 1976. And now we're down to, I think in 2020, I think it was about at 26 or something around there. You see this kind of monotonic decline. And actually, if you kind of use the midpoint and you flip it around and you look at the difference there to there, people actually hate the other party more than they like their party now. So we've actually entered this period where the aversion to the other party exceeds the love of your own party. So affective polarization as a term is usually talked about as the difference between the in-party and the out-party. We're going to actually focus on animosity for reasons that I can discuss in Q&A if people like their theoretical reasons to really think about animosity, although it's also clear that's what's moving here. And so we're going to talk about animosity, and by animosity, we mean how much you dislike the other party. And I'll talk about how we use the thermometer and other things as well to measure that. So what are the consequences of that animosity? People talk a lot about this animosity, right? Not only in academia, but in popular discourse, and even in the news, we hear a lot of discussion of people just hating the other side. So people have studied a lot of the social and economic consequences of that, right? Increased social distance, you don't want to interact with people from the other party. Family relation tension, short Thanksgiving dinners are shorter, right? There are papers showing this, which is kind of interesting. People don't want to date or live with people from the other party, and so on and so forth at increasing rates. Economic consequences, people don't want to hire people from the other party. So there are audit studies where people signal their partisanship, and they're much less likely to get hired if they're in a county where there's a majority of the other party. People want to pay people from the other party less. They are less likely to purchase things if they're connected to the other party. They don't want to work with people from the other party. So we have all this stuff. This is what a lot of social scientists have spent time on. But really interestingly, when we talk about political consequences, which you think would be what we really want, well, this is interesting, but you'd think we'd want to know the political consequences. We don't know a lot. So this is a quote from a paper this year. Research investigating these potential political implications of affective polarization is scarce. And part of this is it's difficult to study for reasons that I'll talk about. But there's just not a lot, there's a lot of worry, but there's not a lot of research on this. And of course, the worry is that voters are going to start to excuse anti-democratic behavior by their own party to defeat the other side, right? They have so much animosity against the other side that they're going to be okay with their party transgressing against democratic norms or other types of behaviors because they just dislike the other side so much. They're privileging party over democracy. And so that's really kind of the big concern, going back to the things that I raised from the founders and so on and so forth. So here's what I'm going to do with kind of those motivations in mind. I'm going to talk about some of our predictions. So we've developed a theory, a psychological theory, which I am not going to talk about at all because it's not that interesting, except for people who are really entrenched and work on motivated reasoning and so forth. So I'm just going to go right to our predictions. Then I'm going to talk about our data, which I think is more interesting. It's a 4-wave national sample panel study, again, as I kind of mentioned. And then I'll talk about an experiment we did to isolate the origins of animosity. And for those of you who are now kind of getting tired of me talking and you want to just know the bottom line, where we end up is animosity does in fact have concerning political consequences, but we also think there's a unique type of pluralism. And that unique type of pluralism is that most people are fairly moderate and fairly disengaged from politics. And that actually has an upside that I'll talk about. And that might be a control for factions. And so that's where we're going to end up. Okay, so again, I'm just jumping right to our hypotheses. Part of this is they really end up being quite straightforward. And so one prediction is that animosity, the extent to which you dislike the other party, would positively correlate with people's political opinions when there are clear party cues. And the basic intuition here is that if you really don't like the other party and you know where the party stand, you want to differentiate yourself from that other party, right? You want to make sure that you are standing with your social group, this need for belonging to your social group. So it's a very kind of social perception of your party. And so when there are clear cues, you're going to go with it. When there are not clear cues and it's really not exactly clear where you should stand, we're not going to see a relationship, right? That's almost kind of follows almost tautologically. If you don't know where you're supposed to be, how can you be there? The more interesting prediction is that we expect there will be no correlation as the direct personal consequences of your opinion increases. So if there are high costs for having a wrong decision, so your social group connection becomes much less important because your personal welfare starts to trump the social group connection and expressing that social group connection. And so that's a condition that will affect the impact of animosity. So those are our predictions. So the inferential strategy is what we did, as I've mentioned several times now, is we opted for an overtime approach with a panel of respondents over 2 years. The little work that has been done on political consequences so far is really using an experimental approach. And again, I'm not going to go into details on why we're kind of suspect of that approach. And I say that as somebody who's largely an experimental social scientist. Most of my work is experimental. I don't think it's the right approach here. And for those of you who are really do a lot of experiments, the main reason is that when you're doing an experiment, you're getting the local average treatment effect. And so it's who's going to be moving in response to that, who's going to comply in response to that treatment. And what we're going to find empirically is that the people who are having these animosity effects are a very small subgroup who are unlikely to be responding to an experimental treatment. And so there are reasons we don't think that's the right approach. But again, I can get more into that later, or people can contact me if they're interested. So the 4 waves were, the first wave in July 2019, where we measured animosity. And then we have 3 other waves: April 2020, October 2020, and April 2021. I'm going to go through a timeline of that in a moment. And so the data, as I mentioned, we have a nationally representative of sample, right? Which is very normal these days. You can do this quite easily, but I think it's quite fascinating that, it was really Roper who was the first person to do this. It was a non-probability sample using a vendor called Bovitz, which I can talk more about it later. It's a quota matched panel. The sample attrition, one of the reasons to use them, that we use them, is they're actually quite good at retaining respondents. And so the attrition was pretty good. We started with over 3,000, and then you can see the response that we were able to retain: 74%, 66%, and 61%. So we even had 61% coming back 2 years later, which we were quite pleased with. We retained more women, older, politically interested, but it largely stayed representative to census benchmarks. So our animosity measure, which we did in the first wave in July 2019, we did the thermometer, which I already described to you, and then we complemented it with 3 other measures. One was trait assessments of the parties: how honest, intelligent, selfish do you think the people from the other party is? How much do you trust the other party? And a social distance battery, which is a very old question that people use about how upset you would be to have neighbors from the other party. How likely would you be to be upset? How comfortable would you be if one of your offsprings married somebody from the other party, and so on and so forth. We created an index which scaled quite well. And then, as I said, we're focusing on animosity, but we also did control for in-party favoritism to make sure that wasn't going on. So before I actually put that up, let me just give you almost a trigger warning of sorts insofar as I'm about to describe the 2 years of your life that you probably don't want to remember very much. Colleen?
Just a quick question. Did you remeasure any of these over time? Like,
We did.
Movement,
yeah, I'm going to actually show you exactly. That's a great question. So I'm going to show you exactly what we found in that. So we remeasured the thermometer right at each wave, and we did all 4 measures at the last wave. And so I will show you that again, because that's a great question. So here's the 2 years that you don't want to remember, and what happened during our data time. So our first wave was in July 2019, which seems like a lifetime ago, right? So if you can even remember this, right? This seemed like a big deal at the time, right? Trump disparaged the 4 Democratic Congress. That was what happened that month. Okay, that was really big news when we were doing this survey. And I remember when that happened, we were collecting these data, and we're like, oh, is this going to really shape our data? And little did we know. Yeah. So okay, so let's move forward, right? We had Trump impeachment #1. Okay, we had the Democratic nomination battle. That's when we did wave 2. We had George Floyd's murder and protests. We had Justice Ginsburg died, Barrett appointed. That's when we did wave 3. Between wave 3 and 4, we had a presidential election, a Capitol insurrection, another impeachment trial. We had the passage of state voting restrictions. Then we did wave 4. What happened, right? So that was politics. Let me remind you of COVID and what was going on during COVID during this time. Okay, this was particularly useful for our inferential strategy, right? In July 2019, COVID did not exist. That's really important to us because one of the things we're going to look at is COVID attitudes and behaviors. And the panel design is really nice here because it means that COVID did not exist. So therefore, COVID opinions or even elite response to COVID could not have possibly shaped our animosity measure when we first measured it, because it wasn't anything anybody knew of. So January 2020, we had the first US COVID case. We had the pandemic declared. In our second wave, the first states were starting to reopen. In October 2020, Trump got COVID. We had 200,000 deaths in the US. Then we had the FDA approved vaccines, the Delta variant. States started to lift restrictions. When we did our final waves, it was just when adults were eligible for vaccines, and then afterwards, U.S. passed 70,000. That's when the Delta variant really started to take off, and so on and so forth. Sorry. Yeah. And so that's kind of the panel. And so coming back to Colleen's question. So one thing to know, for the first graph here is just our distribution from our first wave of our animus measure. It's kind of a normal distribution, but the notable thing, which I'll come back to, is it has a long tail at the end. So there's a reasonable number of people who have a lot of animosity. It has a much longer tail on that side than that side. So this is our, as I said, in wave 1, we did the 4 measures. In wave 4, we remeasured the 4 measures. And we found a remarkable amount of stability. Even though we had those 2 years of all those things happening, people retained pretty much the same levels of animosity that they did from wave 1 to wave 4. And so you can see kind of how crowded it is around this 45-degree line. It was about an 0.82 degree correlation. And then if you go wave by wave where we did the thermometer in each wave, it stayed pretty stable, which we found quite interesting, somewhat surprising, but also kind of useful insofar as we were using a measure that was still in people's minds. So it does beg a question of kind of what are the forces that are moving animosity over time, and I'll come back to that briefly at the end. And so, but that's kind of the stability that we find. Okay, so this is not a table I want anybody to actually read very much of, because it's not a fun table to read. I just wanted to give you a sense of these are all the things that we measured over the 4 waves. And I obviously don't have time to go through most of them. And so, right, each wave we measured a fair number of different things in different areas. We measured different issue positions. We measured various COVID-19. We measured various actor evaluations, like what do you think of different political leaders, scientific leaders, so on and so forth. We measured democratic principles, which I'll talk about, and we measured partisan compromise. What I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give you selected examples from selected areas, because there are other things I want to talk about as well, but it'll be representative of our findings more generally. I want to talk about COVID-19, and I want to talk about democratic principles. And so I'm just going to show you a few results from there. So COVID-19, as I said, is a very interesting issue for us to look at, insofar as we knew that we could have some exogeneity for our animosity measure as a causal force. And as I don't really need to talk about this, but as everybody knows, right, the parties quickly, I'll show you in a moment, but fairly quickly divided, right? Republicans were not in support of health safety measures, and the Democrats, and they wanted to reopen the economy, and the Democrats were much more worried about health safety. This is just simply a graph of the states that shut down during the original outbreak of COVID. You can see, for example, the states that never shut down or had any restrictive rules are all red states. And so you can kind of see there, you see the early states where California did it first. We all probably remember when California did this, and at least I remember exactly where I was when this happened. And so we have very clear party cues, right, coming back to our prediction, which is the point here. So I'm going to start just with mask wearing. And so this is just a question of we asked people if they were wearing masks. We asked 15 different behaviors, but mask wearing is obviously a particularly interesting one given the extent to which it was politicized. So in April 2020, it was quite interesting, because in April 2020, this is hard to remember this, but this was a point at which the mask guidance was extremely unclear. Okay, right. The reasoning was because the CDC was and they were very worried about masks being used up and not being available for healthcare workers. So the parties had actually not come out and taken clear stances on this. And so if you look in our April 2020 data, and so on the x-axis is just the percentile where you are on the animosity scale. There's no national metric for animosity, so we just use percentile. And then the y-axis is the likelihood of people wearing masks. And these are all predictive values from models with a large number of controls. And so what you see is you don't see, as animosity increases, you don't see a really big divide between Democrats and Republicans. I could show you other behaviors where we'll see big divides, but for mask wearing, we don't see it. There weren't really those clear cues yet. If you started to look at the other lines, those are from later waves where we started to have really clear cues, right? So in the other 2 waves, it's become very apparent what Republicans thought about masks and what Democrats thought about masks, right? And so what you see is as animosity increases, Republicans become much less likely to wear masks, and Democrats, they're kind of hitting a ceiling, because even those at the very low levels of animosity, they're almost at the 90% level of likelihood of wearing masks, but you still see a little bit of an increase in likelihood of wearing masks. So this is one particular finding. Again, we can look at a scale of behaviors. If we just do the whole scale of behaviors, we pretty much get something that looks more like this. But the mask, when we pull out mask wearing, it's particularly interesting because of the cue taking dynamic on masks specifically. But social distancing, for example, which was very clear early on, we see that kind of this animosity effect throughout. I'm going to move to talking about public policies and show you a graph of that. So the measures here are just things like in the early waves, we asked things like, do you think all but essential businesses should close down? Do you think there should be fines for people who are not following social distancing rules? Do you think schools should close down? In later waves, we focused a lot on schools. We also talked about regulating businesses insofar as if they should be requiring mask wearing. And so there were some hypothetical policies as well. And so, but there were just different restrictive health restrictive public policies. And what I want to show you here is a test of our third prediction, I guess, which was basically as the COVID gets more severe, as the personal consequences of having the wrong opinion become severe, we expect the animosity effect to disappear. And so that's what I want to look at. And so what we did is, what I'm going to show you is results from the second wave. And where here we measured the severity of your COVID risk in terms of the number of cases in your county. Okay, so the more cases you had in the county, the more we expected the animosity effect to disappear because the risk of COVID became so great, you no longer are going to be following your party so clearly. So first, let me show you the lines. The lines I'm showing you or highlighting here are cases where there are low consequences. So these are kind of a lower, yeah, Colleen.
I'm sorry, just really quickly, I think the premise of having sort of personal consequences was and is tied to sort of belief in science, belief in the narrative about sort of what the consequences of not mask wearing were, which gets like tied in with partisanship. But it sounds like you're setting this up as sort of we all agree on what the consequences were, whereas in reality, we didn't all agree.
Yeah, and so we did two different things along this. So we wanted to use case counts early on because basically our expectation for case counts was people who are living in areas where there are high case counts, they are having direct exposure to hospitals overflowing, kind of people they know dying from COVID and so on and so forth. And so they were then going to be taking COVID more seriously. But potentially, I mean, we did measure trust in science, and so that's in all of these models. That became a much more salient feature in the later waves. So in the later waves, what I'm not showing you here, we actually pre-registered this switch because by that time we didn't think cases would matter for exactly the reasons that you're getting at. Because this is really early. This is April. So people who are having high cases, I guess our expectation were even people who were having high cases, even if their trust in science was not high, they were seeing people all over dying. And so we thought that they would think there were consequences. In our later two waves, we changed the moderator from cases, and we just asked people directly, how severe we asked, there were several measures, but it's basically the severity of the experience you've had or the severity of the experience you would anticipate having. And for that, we use that instead of trust in science or the trust in science of COVID-19 specifically, but it was quite highly correlated in terms of their perceptions of severity. So you're exactly right that the trust in science became quite relevant, especially in our later two waves. It's not the measure we ended up using, but it was highly correlated with the measure we ended up using, which was the direct perception or experience of severity of COVID-19. So yeah, it's a great question. But in this early wave, we used case counts. We didn't measure the perceived severity here, and it didn't have as strong of an effect. We hadn't even thought about it at this point when we did this survey. I'll have to go back to see if it had a significant effect or not. It's a good question. But these are the people in low case count areas. And so you see the Democrats, you see a little bit of polarization on these policies, so they're becoming more supportive of the policies as they are living in high case count. As they get more animosity, they're becoming a little bit more supportive of the policy. But Republicans is the most remarkable, right? In the low case count areas, so they're not really worried about COVID. And you see as animosity increases, they're becoming way more opposed to these types of policies, right? So you get down here, you're getting the probability of supporting these policies is about 0.25. So they're kind of pretty much opposed to these types of policies that most of the rest, even the low animus Republicans were supportive of it at this point. So you see this large animosity effect. Now, if we look at people in these high case count areas, okay, we see Republicans in the high case count areas, as animosity increases, we're not quite exactly sure why, but it actually, as animosity goes up, they actually become slightly more supportive of the policies. We don't know exactly why there's a slight increase, but the larger message for us is it's canceling out them following what the Republicans were saying at that point. And for the Democrats, you see there's a little bit of an uptick around the 67th percentile, but it's also pretty flat because what you're seeing going on here is that the low animus Democrats are a little bit higher themselves. And so the basic story though is when case counts were high, the animosity effect is strongly moderated. And again, I could show you this. I'm going to stop talking about COVID now, but I could show you this. We found that we found the same results if we looked at perceived worry about COVID, perceived safety of different behaviors themselves, evaluations. So we looked at the evaluations of Fauci over time, which is actually quite interesting because the extent to which he was politicized over time moved around a little bit. We looked at the CDC. We looked at vaccines, kind of likelihood of taking vaccines and so on and so forth. And you find similar types of results throughout. Animosity has a pretty big effect, but in cases where, early on case counts and later on perceived severity, it is muted, not disappear, but muted. So our point is obviously showing partisan divides on COVID-19 is, there have been, probably hundreds of papers by now that's showing that. Our point is that this is stemming from animosity, which is something that might be a little bit concerning given the basis of animosity, and I'll come back to that a little bit. Coming back to our theory, so we find no clear effects of animosity when there's no cues, such as the early mask wearing, and we found less effects when the personal stakes are high, cases early and perceived severity later. This really reveals, I think quite clearly the consequences of the mixed messaging and animosity, right? We kind of put experts aside. It became very politicized early, and even the early mask wearing messaging was, so problematic that we didn't see people wearing it, right? If you go way back, likelihood of wearing a mask for everybody, right? They're only about at the 50 percentile. And again, because they were being told very mixed messages on if they should be wearing masks. All right, so I'm going to move to talking about a second outcome variable here, democratic principles, and specifically democratic norms. And so norms are maintained through social sanctions and rewards. And ideally, right, voters reward those who uphold norms and punish those who do not. And of course, the concern that I talked about before is that politicians will flout norms when they can benefit. And so our prediction is as animosity increases, partisans are going to sacrifice the norms and they're going to help to privilege their own party. But it also is going to depend on who controls the executive. And I'll get back to that in a moment. I'm going to first show you just some very basic results. So this is just from our third wave. Sorry, you can't see it that well on the screen, but this is a question that asks, should your party do anything they can to block a Supreme Court nominee from the other party? This was asked in October of 2020. So this was before the election. It was right after Barrett was appointed. And so what you see is that as animosity increases, you see that the partisans become much more likely to say, yes, your party, if they were to control the Senate, should do anything they can to prevent the other party's nominee from being put in place. And you can imagine why the Democratic line is just the intercept is shifted up, because this was right after Barrett was appointed. And so they were, they had animosity aside from their levels of animosity. And so, if we also ask another example of a question like that in October 2020 wave, we also asked people if they thought if it would be legitimate to challenge an election loss if it was so close that in one state, in a swing state, if the election difference between the candidates was, and then we varied if it was 1,000 votes, 10,000 votes, or 100,000 votes. And this was, again, before the election actually took place. And what we found here is, again, you can kind of see as animosity goes up, we're merging the parties here because the results were pretty much the same between the parties. As the animosity goes up, partisans believe that it became more and more legitimate to challenge the election, depending on the closeness of the race. You can see that when it's only a 1,000 count different, that's going to be more legitimate than a 10,000 or 100,000. But you're getting, right, even for 100,000 vote different, you're getting partisans at the highest levels of animosity. They're getting pretty close to saying it's very legitimate to challenge the vote outcome. Okay. Now I'm going to switch to so these are very applied examples of outcome variables. I'm going to switch to something a little bit more abstract. We ask people their support for these abstract norms, like should the executive do whatever they can, regardless of their means, to accomplish what they need to do. We ask about checks and balances. I'm going to show you the checks and balances one. This is a particularly interesting thing for us to look at because we can look at it. We measured this in our first wave, actually, in July 2019 when Trump was the president, and then we measured it in our last wave when Biden was the president. And so you have a change in who controls the executive. And so the idea here is that you should see a change in which party is going to be more supportive of these norms, right? When you're in the opposition, you're going to really want checks and balances, but when you're in control, you're not going to want checks and balances. Okay, so it's a nice test of our animosity prediction, right? The animosity effect should flip depending on who controls. And so, right, this is when the party is out of power, what I'm going to focus on. So you see so again, this is how much you agree on the importance of checks and balances. The Democrats in 2019, which is that top dark line, not huge because they're generally supportive, but you do see an animosity effect. As animosity increases, they become more likely to think checks and balances are good. And then you look at Republicans in 2021, and you can see as animosity increases, that's the kind of the great dashed line. You see as animosity increases, they become much more likely to think checks and balances are really good, right? These are Republicans when Biden's president. Now, if we look at what the results look like when the party was in power, right? So you see the Democrats in 2021, right? They thought in 2019 checks and balances were really good. Now these high animus, these are the same respondents, right? Because this is a panel. These same respondents flipped their views. So the high animus Democrats were all really strongly agree in 2019, and they went to somewhat agree in 2021. Again, the same respondents were changing their views on these norms. Republicans in 2019, right? As you see animosity increases, it's not a huge effect, but you see somewhat of an effect of them thinking that checks and balances were not, I'm sorry, right. So they're not as good. I'm sorry, it's a little bit of a decline. Goes up a little bit, which is a little bit counter what we'd expect. But generally you see a little bit of a decline in 2019 insofar as they don't think checks and balances are as good. So again, you kind of see, this is kind of like a party Q effect insofar as it depends on where your party stands, and that's how conditioning how animosity works. So a summary of this is we find similar results if we look at gerrymandering, arresting other party protesters, expanding oversight of the other party. And for the kind of applied norms, for the abstract norms, we get similar results for separation of powers, institutional respect, executive power. And again, it's contingent on party cues and who controls the executive. One important point you may have noticed, though, support for norms actually are middle to high. Okay, the norm support was not as low as you might think in terms of when you hear people talk about democracy these days. Generally people were fairly supportive of these norms. All right, so where does this leave us? I still have a bit to go, but I'm gonna kind of take a pause and say, where does this leave us now, and what does this mean? And then I'll talk about that a bit. So we found evidence of the political effects of animosity on COVID-19, on democratic principles. I showed you that table before. We look at all these other things. We find pretty similar dynamics when we look at policy attitudes across the various domains, actor evaluations, like evaluations of these scientific figures or political figures, including governors, mayors. Of course, we find no effect for mayors. Most people don't know the partisanship of their mayor, or they guess it based on where they live, right? I assume everybody here probably knows that the mayor is a Democrat, but if you live in a city where it's not so clearly homogenous, people actually have no idea what the partisanship of their mayor is, and partisan compromise. The effects are contingent on the nature of party signals and whether there are clear personal consequences. One thing I did not point out, but if you look closely at the graph, and coming back to my point about using experimental methods here, nearly all of the effects are concentrated at the top of the distribution. So most of the lines, when we look across all these outcomes, it really jumps up when you hit about the 67th percentile. So it's really those high animosity people that are really having the effect here. Okay, so is this worrisome? You might think it is. Partisans are privileging partisan ends over democratic means and substantive considerations when it comes to COVID-19. Traditional sources of pluralism have faded, right? We have ideological and social sorting, meaning that most Republicans are conservatives and they have certain demographic features. Most Democrats are now liberals and they have certain demographic features. So that undermines pluralism. And then this can undermine the focal point of democratic stability, right? Because we're not keeping the politicians in line. But I'm going to make 3 points, and I'm going to show you some data for 3 points, which is kind of I'm not going to make 3 points that are going to make you feel really good in the end, but it's going to make you feel a little bit better, at least a glimmer of better, to not jump to a kind of a dire conclusion. One is the relationship between animosity and non-electoral actions. Then I'm going to talk about perceptions of the other side, and then I'm going to talk about the perceptions on animosity. So I'm going to make these 3 points. So the first point is we measured in our survey also how likely would you be to kind of break laws or engage in violence in reaction to different things? Like if your party lost the election, if there were protests from the other side, right? So for Republicans, this was protest by Black Lives Matter. For Democrats, it was protest by people who supported police. This is just the election result, but the results are pretty similar. So this was how likely would you be engaged in non-violently breaking the law? And you see the relationship with animosity. There's a very slight relationship, but not a very strong relationship. There's a much stronger, there are a lot of other variables that explain that relationship much more better, much more strongly. And then if we look at the likelihood of you engaging in violence, it's flat. Okay, so having more animosity does not lead you to do more extra legal activities. Okay, what's going on here, what drives those things are kind of anti-establishment orientations. So it's really more people who are basically against the system. People are more likely to believe in conspiracies, and they're kind of people. The reason why animosity is not having an effect here in part is when you have animosity, it means you're kind of in the system because you have a political orientation that's leading you to have an evaluation of the parties. Whereas these types of behaviors are people who are feeling pretty alienated by the system, which is something that we should be worried about, but something outside of the domain of what we're looking at here. And so that's our first point. The second point is, what do people think of the other party? So we asked people in one of our waves, what are their perceptions of the other party in terms of how often they talk about politics? So the red line is the perceived frequency with which the other party talks about politics, and the gray is the actual frequency with which people talk about politics. So people think 64% of those in the other party talk about politics frequently. You get the same result if we ask them about posting about politics online. The reality is only 27% of people talk about politics frequently. The modal person talks about it occasionally, but we perceive the modal outpartisan to talk about it 30% of it, or only 30% of it. And then we ask them the same thing about ideology. Okay, so people think 69% of those from the other party are extreme, meaning that they think that if you're a Democrat, you think that Republicans are extreme conservatives. If you're a Republican, you think that Democrats are extreme liberals. Okay, that 69% of them are. In reality, only 38% of them are. So people have these vast misperceptions of where the other side stands, and that has consequences. So overall, partisans overestimate the amount of ideologues who frequently discuss politics by a factor of 3.5 when we conjoin these two things. And that has pretty significant consequences for animosity. And I'll show you this. What we did is we asked people the thermometer question. And we asked them, the canonical way and the main way to do this is just say evaluate Democrats and Republicans, right? Which is what I showed you at the very start of the talk. But we asked some people to analyze Democrats and Republicans. We asked other people to say, what do you think of Democrats who are moderates who rarely talk about politics? What do you think about Democrats who are moderates who occasionally talk about politics? So we asked all these mixes of what do you think of these people to see if different types of partisans affected their evaluations of animosity. And what we found was when they rated extremists who frequently discuss politics, they got a score of 32. That is the exact same score they got when they just rated Democrats or Republicans without labels. In other words, they were presuming when they thought about a Democrat or Republicans, they were just picturing in their mind the extremists who frequently discuss politics, which makes sense because that's what they're perceiving them to be. Okay? But the modal person is actually a moderate who occasionally discusses politics. And when you ask people to rate those people, they're fairly indifferent, right? They give them a score of 47. When you ask them about moderates who rarely discuss politics, again, this is all from the other side. They actually like them more than dislike them at 56%. And so the consequence of that is that animosity leads to extreme partisan responses. That was like the main part of the talk that I gave you. But if perceptions were accurate with the other side, if those perceptions were accurate, okay, the misperceptions, if those were actually accurate, then there probably would be a reason to be concerned, okay, right? Because the other side would be so different from you And then that would lead to these behaviors, which might be something that you can explain because, wow, they are really extreme, they're very engaged, and so they're doing things against us. And this is just another graph. We asked people the likelihood that you thought the other side was going to engage in breaking the law or violent behavior. And this is animosity. And so I'll just look at the violence graph. This is quite remarkable, right? So this is how likely do you think the other party is going to engage in violence if their party loses the election? And you see as animosity increases, you get to the point where those who are high in animus think it's somewhat likely that the other party is going to engage in violence. You might remember the graph where I showed you the actual likelihood, and it was, basically all not likely. Okay? So these perceptions are driving people to have these ideas of the other party of doing these things that they're actually not that likely to do. So that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make here, is that these misperceptions increase animosity, and that high animosity has these consequences. Okay. And so the implication is that these misperceptions about animosity leads partisans to accept representatives who violate democratic norms. And that's a really serious concern. Okay. So in 1997, Barry Weingast, who's a political scientist, wrote an article about the stability, kind of what leads to stable democracy. And he had a footnote in that article. He didn't talk about the US. This was a theoretical article. And he had a footnote in the article. And he just said, the US Constitution has provided binding in practice, partly because citizens are willing to defend it by reacting against proposed violations. Anticipating that reaction, political leaders rarely attempt violations. Citizens' reaction implies the US constitutional restrictions on elected officials are self-enforcing. His basic idea is, because partisans from the other side are going to punish their representatives for transgressions, you're going to punish people from your side for doing transgressions. Okay? In 2022, that's the concern that we're not seeing, right? Those high animosity partisans, they're not doing that. They are okay with their representatives violating these democratic norms. So when that happens, we move away from this focal point of democratic stability, and that is quite concerning. So the solution, one solution would be that to think about that there is this pluralism between engaged and not so engaged partisans or citizens. So this is not the typical type of pluralism that people talk about, right? People usually talk about pluralism in terms of people with different group belief systems and so on and so forth, or different demographic attributes. But one source of heterogeneity in the public that cross-cuts parties is the extent of engagement in ideological extremity. And so if we can appreciate that diversity within the parties and correct the misperceptions, that could lower animosity, and people will be less likely to lower the elite abuse of power. In other words, I would not want to trust elites in any way, right? And so they're going to do things in their self-interest. And partisans with high animosity are going to excuse that. If we can lower that by making them realize that the other side actually does not have so much animosity themselves, then they might be less likely to excuse them. It's a bit of an ironic solution insofar as a political scientist, you're kind of brought up, right? You're brought up to kind of say, like, we want all citizens to be engaged and have ideological constraint. And basically what I'm saying is actually not so much. That we should appreciate that there's actually variation in that. And that's important, because if everybody was ideologically engaged, at this point in time, we have two very different sides. Those perceptions would be accurate, and people maybe would have good reason to have the feelings that they did. The problem, of course, why this is not such oh, okay, everything is fine, is that how do you get people to appreciate this in lower levels of animosity? There's a steady stream of work now about just correcting those misperceptions, and I've done some of this myself, where you just basically go in and you're like, oh, your perceptions are wrong. And then people are like, okay, I'll adjust. And that's all good, but I don't think it's robust at all. In fact, I just finished data collection where I did that kind of correction, but then I introduced like a correction that said, like, basically you can't trust survey evidence because there's a lot of margin of error, and then the correction didn't work at all. These simple corrections are interesting, but they're not that robust, I think. So there are more complex solutions, talking about social media portrayals, journalistic emphasis. I think one place to really look is cohort change. And that's something I could talk about it, well, not at length because I don't know a ton about it, but I think it's an interesting solution because millennials are an interesting group. They tend to kind of be much more likely to worry about collective goods, and they worry about climate change, social justice, even people on the Republican side do. But on the other hand, they also have pretty high levels of animosity. And so how that plays out will be unclear. So to conclude, there's a massive worry about animosity. The political consequences are unclear. We find clear political consequences, depends on cues and motivations. It's concentrated amongst those with the most animosity. High animosity partisans are not more likely to act, so they're not an imminent threat, but high levels of animosity for misperceptions provide elites leeway, and the concern is about elites exploiting that beyond just gridlock, but actually undermining, the things that we're seeing going on now and kind of trying to undermine democratic norms. And misperceptions probably are part of the solution. The question is, how do we go about doing that, which is, I think, harder than it may appear at first glance. And so that's it. Sorry, I know it's a lot to cover. But thank you very much. And I'll just say one more time that, all the methods used in this really, again, go back to the history of what was going on here and Roper. And so, I think it's always good to appreciate that kind of historical lineage of why you're using the methods that you are. So thank you again, and I welcome questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. This was terrific. I really appreciate you sharing all this with us. So I want to offer two observations in the spirit of they're probably wrong, and then have you correct them. And so both relate to the COVID analysis. And so you presented it as worrisome, which on one hand, I totally agree with. On the other, I kept wondering if the animosity could be viewed as almost close to rational, in the sense that this is early on, the early on data you showed, that if I really have a lot of animosity and there wasn't a direct, like a strong perceived threat, I was really opposed to the mask, and that sort of would probably feel good, like I'm going against the side I really dislike. And then when my health was more likely to be affected, then is there a way to view the data as partisans, even at high level of animosities, were behaving in some sort of, I don't know, rational is not quite the right word, but in a way that's less worrisome and more makes sense. So that's kind of observation / question one. And then the other, also related to the data, I was really interested in the intercept difference before the cues, where sort of absence of cues, Democrats were much more, it looked like substantially more likely to support the mask wearing. And I think a lot of times, both in media and research, there's this portrayal of Trump took a stance, just an uninformed stance against masks, and the Republican Party followed, and Republicans followed, and it was sort of all about leadership, which I think there's really some strong evidence here. But also that natural shift pre-cues is kind of consistent with what we might think of as a conservative ideology: less government involvement, don't tell me what to do. And it feels like, to push towards the science of wearing masks, recognizing that there's absence of cues, a possible ideological or belief difference underlying the two parties is potentially really important to recognize, that I haven't heard a lot about. So just interested in your thoughts on those 2 points.
Yeah, those are fantastic questions, and not wrong at all, as usual, Peter. So the first question is a really great question, and I think the idea here with COVID is, if you have to think about it in terms of the difference between individual rationality and kind of thinking about this during a public health crisis. And so, yeah, I think is it individually rational to follow kind of this group attachment, especially as your animosity increases? And I think that it would be. I think, if you've kind of read much of Dan Kahan's work on motivated reasoning, he would make the case that actually this is quite rational, because you want to be sticking to your group. It's in your self-interest to be doing that. And the more you want to the more you dislike the other group, the more you want to differentiate yourself. And so in that sense, it is individually sensible. And so far, it probably gave a more psychic utility to people to be acting in this way, especially as they saw these groups as more and more different. I guess the concern, I mean, I have to think more. It's not a question I'd thought about before. I guess the concern is, during a public health crisis, on one side at least, that leads to kind of a undermining of the public good. And so insofar as the animosity and a group attachment on one side was kind of having negative public consequences, that becomes somewhat problematic insofar as it was not consistent with what public health officials would be saying. If you, but you could easily counter by saying like, oh, but were public health officials giving the right advice and so on and so forth. So it becomes a question of what is the normative baseline by which would be the appropriate COVID response. And I guess we are implicitly, well, I guess not so implicitly because you've pointed it out now, but we're kind of taking the presumption that the normative baseline was the advice of public health officials at a given time.
And just a quick, in the sense of like, if the speed limit's 55 and I drive 65, like in a statistical sense, I have to be increasing like the probability of sort of a crash or something.
Yeah.
But I like, and there isn't an explicit guideline, but I would, you know, off the record drive 65, right? And so like I'm going against the guideline. And so, you know, again, like I don't know how to measure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the concern is,
and look, I have a mask on, like I'm 100% pro mask. So like, this is much more like,
yeah, we all know you're doing that just for expressive display in your, so no, I think it's a great question. I think the ultimate concern here is that, that if your attachment to a political group is leading you to certain behaviors that then kind of undermine the collectivity, which is really clear in the democratic norms examples, it becomes concerning politically. And so in the COVID example, it becomes concerning for the public good. So ultimately, it becomes a threat, you know, that one partisanship, which you want parties to always be kind of having some national interest in mind. If that starts to kind of not have a national interest in mind, you know, I think you've pointed out in the COVID example, it's much less clear than in the democratic norm example, because we can debate what is in the national interest in the COVID example. And I think that's a really fair point and something that we should take account of more carefully. Your second question, yeah, I didn't mean to. One of the things in presenting this is that we're looking at all these outcome variables, and we need to be careful, which I wasn't in presenting it, that we're not saying that we're providing a full explanation for these particular behaviors. And we did have value measures on there. We had the cultural cognition measures, and those certainly were highly correlated with mask wearing. So more free market, people who had more free market inclinations, regardless of their partisanship, were much less likely to be wearing masks. And they're obviously much less likely to be Democrats. And so there certainly are different values underlying those things. And I think that's an important point. I think the interesting point for us was that one thing I didn't discuss is what are the sources of animosity. And the research to date suggests that the sources of animosity are at best marginally related to values per se. That it largely is driven from kind of social sorting and kind of your perception of the other side as being demographically very different from you. And so insofar as animosity is somewhat detached from values and substantive policy consideration, it's more of kind of just a group assessment that doesn't have a lot of substantive basis. If that was wrong and it had more of a substantive basis, then the results would be more, there'd be more explanation for the substance under the results. But we actually don't in the project ourselves look at the underlying basis of animosity other than this misperception stuff. But like, why is it in the first place? We're kind of taking it as a starting point. But it is a debated starting point too. There are people who don't fully agree with what I just said. So it's a very good question. And more generally, we need to be careful to make clear we're not explaining each of these outcome variables in the graphs I'm showing you.
Jamie, I just wanted to know, it's the first thing about the COVID and the various rationality from the two sides. It was also mask wearing was being pitched very differently to the two sides. The Republican sides were pitching mask wearing as an individual protection. How much safer did it make you against COVID? Democratic side were pitching it as community responsibility, stopping other people sick, and it'll help you as well. So it was being as an individual liberty thing on one side. Sure, it's going to help me, but if I want to take that risk, I don't have to do anything about it. Whereas the Democratic side, it was a collective responsibility thing. So both sides were looking at it rationality in insanely different ways.
Yeah. In the beginning, yeah. I think that's right. And so
that colored a lot of people's reactions afterward. Were ones I was always looking at as an individual choice.
Yeah.
Whether I do this or not, I don't have collective responsibility for it, just whether I get sick or not.
Yeah, that's a great point. Right. It led the rhetoric. The underlying argument stayed the same. It's just the application of it evolved. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, I mean, I focus more on the mixed messaging from public health officials, but yeah, that's a good point.
I just wanted to mention the online questions, but you're
Yeah, I just put, I don't know if I wanted to put them all on the screen, but yeah. So Mark Zelwin, have you? Yes. So there are a few articles that we've written that have been published. People can email me. I can send them, and we are working on a book manuscript for all of it because it's just too much. Yeah, I mean, it's actually an interesting story of how the project came to be because we had done that original July survey. We didn't actually have ambitions to go further, and then COVID happened, and we realized we had this opportunity to do a panel where we could look at a reaction of an issue that came. You don't get a lot of cases in American politics where an issue becomes salient out of nowhere, and so we kind of took advantage of that, and then we just kept collecting data. So I appreciate the question. So is animosity just a proxy for strong partisanship? Yeah, it's a great question. Can you gauge how prevalent high levels of animosity are among the public at large and as a share of those with strong partisan identity? Yeah, it's a really great question because there are lots of different concepts out there. So I'm going to talk about three. There's animosity, which is what we looked at. There's the extremity of your partisanship, which is on a 7-point scale. 1 would be a very extreme Republican, 7 would be a very extreme Democrat, or you could flip it. And then there's partisanship as a social identity, which is just a question of things like when you think about your party, do you use the term we versus they? How important to you is your partisan identity? We measured all of these things. Our theory was based around partisan animosity because our idea here is that partisan animosity is virtually a proxy for the extent that you would be motivated to protect your partisanship, insofar as that the more you dislike the other party, the more you're going to be directionally motivated to distinguish yourself from that other party. And so that was our theoretical basis for animosity. We measured extremity and partisanship as a social identity. They are, not surprisingly, correlated at non-trivial levels with animosity, but it is animosity that is driving the effects empirically that we're finding. And so, that said, the relationship between these three concepts, I think, is a topic for, that needs to be sorted out somewhat because you have different people kind of using these different concepts. And my answer being like, oh, we can control for those doesn't mean that we've understood the relationship between them very well. And so, yeah, I appreciate the question. Tom, oh, thank you for joining, Tom. I wonder, how do you think about so yes, so this is a great question, Tom. So this is coming back to the experimental work that I was talking about before. And so the Druckman Kala Westwood paper is a paper that is forthcoming in the American Journal of Political Science. And what they do in that paper is that they do an experimental intervention to manipulate levels of animosity or affective polarization. And what they do is that they have people play a trust game insofar as, so they would have, say they have me play, the respondent would play a game and say, they would tell me that I was playing a game with somebody from the other party. So say I'm a Republican and I'm going to play the game with John. But in fact, I'm not actually playing the game with somebody from the other party. I'm actually playing a game with a computerized thing that they're manipulating. And so in the low affective polarization condition, you play the trust game and the person from the other party gives you a lot of money back. In the high animosity or the high affective polarization case, the person from the other party keeps all the money. And so it leads you to kind of not like the other party or like the other party. And they find that people who are manipulated in the high affective polarization manipulation or the low affective polarization and manipulation, they then have all these different measures in other games that they play. They don't find that manipulation has any effect on things like cue taking, on democratic norms, partisan compromise, a lot of the things we measure. So it actually looks like exactly like not what we're finding. And so their argument would be, oh, you're just confounded and you're ignoring things, which is always a threat. We have this good causal leverage insofar as we have exogeneity of COVID and we have a lot of control variables, but of course we never can know for sure in panel data. Our response, and the reason that we worry about experimental data, is that we think in our data, which is why I emphasize most of our movement is at the 67% level and higher. And so if they are driving the effects, when you do an experimental manipulation, our expectation is that you're getting a local average treatment effect, which is what I briefly mentioned before, meaning that you're looking at the people who are compliant with the manipulation. So there's only going to be a subset of people in their experiment that actually were moved from those trust games. the people at the sixth who are already going into that with high levels of animosity are unlikely to have been the people that were moved. Okay, we can't know that for sure because they didn't measure effective polarization before they did the intervention. But our guess is there's not a lot of room for those people to move, especially getting them higher. And they're also people who already have pretty strong opinions about the other party. So if they're not moving, they're not going to find effects. Okay, so what they're finding is that in the people who complied with their experiment, okay, they are finding that there's no average effect. So in the average in the population, there's no effect, is what they're presuming. And what we're saying is, well, the effect is concentrated amongst this people at the high end of the scale, and your experimental treatment, those are non-compliers. And so therefore, you're not going to find an effect. And so our answer is that what we think that paper, and there's actually another paper, which I'm actually a co-author on, which finds similar non-effects in these experimental treatments. And we use different, instead of a trust game, we actually use things like interventions to lower effective polarization. So like think of a friend from the other party, or we show a picture of two elites, McConnell and Schumer having lunch together. And that tends to lower effective polarization. We also don't find a spillover effect. But again, we think those are interesting papers insofar as that they show these interventions have limited downstream consequences, but we don't think that those are sufficient to show animosity doesn't have an effect for the reasons that I discussed. Yeah, I mean, I know these authors disagree with us. And so what you would need to do is do these interventions where you had a prior measure of polarization and see who was actually being compliant. But it's a great and an important question, Tom, especially because their paper's gotten a lot of attention for people who are worried about effective polarization. And that's kind of our approach. And again, this is a very interesting project for me because, again, as I mentioned early on, I'm generally an experimentalist, and I just did not think that was the approach to get at this problem. But I appreciate the question, and it's one that I think is not, the conversation is not over on that issue, I think, as well. Yeah.
There's a slide kind of in the middle that showed these Republicans who had low animosity. I think were like very likely to wear a mask under the threat condition, like I think more so than anybody else. And I wonder if there's something special about these low animosity people.
Yeah, I mean, we did look. I don't have these slides. We tracked kind of what do the low animosity people and what do the high animosity people look like? How do they differ? And what we found was, not surprisingly, the high animosity people kind of across parties are much more likely to be politically engaged. They're much more likely to have strong partisan identities, like of the measures that that Jeremy asked me about on the screen that I was talking about before. The low animosity people are not very attached to their parties. They're not very involved in politics. Demographically, you find kind of the stereotypes that you would think. So, for example, white, religious, lower educated people are higher animosity in Republicans. Minority, higher educated individuals, actually the non-religious were the highest animosity people in the Democrats. And so there are they are quite different people, which again comes back to Tom's question in terms of like, who are these people at the high animosity? They're quite different than I think the people complying in the experiment. But in terms of who they are, then they're having very different life experiences. Why they kind of were high on mask wearing, which was I can't answer that question. We have the same curiosity of exactly what was driving them to react in that way. So we can describe what they look like demographically and politically, but I don't know why they did that. I mean, one thing we could do actually, which we haven't done, is we do have the zip codes of them. I don't know if they happen to largely be in areas where there were particularly different norms. They maybe were surrounded by more Democrats. It's a great question that we should explore, because it has been a nagging. There are a few trends, even in what I showed you, there were a few points where I hesitated and I was like, well, we don't know exactly. There are a few points like that where we probably should dig a little bit deeper to kind of understand.
I also wonder about that definition of engagement, because I mean, engagement could mean that maybe you're listening to Amy Goodman or Rush Limbaugh, or it could mean that you really want to get something out of politics, in which case you're gonna. I mean, if you want to win on your own issues, you're gonna deal with whoever you have to deal with, you know what I mean? And whereas for some people, engagement just seems to literally, for some people, engagement is like, I want something out of politics. For other people, engagement could be, I'm a tool for my group or something, you know?
Yeah, that's that's a fantastic question. Yeah, because by engagement, what we did was we measured how often, well, pretty much similar to the questions I looked at in the perceptions, how often do you talk about politics, post in politics, which is the latter example of what you were talking about. We also did measure though, which we didn't look at though, but I will, we had a long list of kind of media that people expose themselves to, you know, and it was, you know, those of you familiar with the ANES module, you know, there's like a ton of programs. And so we actually can look at who's looking at things like mainstream versus partisan media, which we didn't look at, to look at how that varied in terms of engagement, what they were actually doing media-wise. So that's a great point that we can look at. So thank you. So that's a lot of non-responses, but I appreciate your advice, John.
Jamie, I know that in the chat there was at least 1 or 2 questions. I don't know if you wanted to talk over there.
Oh.
In the top bar, there's a little chat feature that has the number 10.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay.
So there might be something there.
Oh, good point. Oh, there's many.
Down a little bit. What role do elites like candidates, elected officials, party leadership play in the increase in animus and affective polarization? Has this become a central and deliberate campaign strategy to exploit affective polarization? Yeah, that's a great question. So kind of the consensus on kind of the causes of animosity are 3 different forces. One being social media and partisan media. That's the most debated, and that's not a area where I have a particular position one way or another. I mean, intuition suggests that must be playing a role, but there is some debate about this. You know, I think the most definitive evidence of that, those are this paper where there's a deactivation experiment where people were paid to deactivate their Facebook accounts, and that did decrease affective polarization. And so I think that's pretty good evidence of that. A second cause is social sorting, which I kind of talked about a little bit insofar as the parties have become demographically very distinctive. And so it becomes almost a mega identity, right? Insofar as it encompasses all these other things that are different than you, which, you know, if you look at kind of the percentage by demographic groups, you know, going back to 1972 versus 2020, you know, it's completely different. And there's been this massive social sorting. And the third thing is elites. The amount of elite partisan rhetoric in Congress has increased dramatically over time. So there was a great paper that looked at the extent to which people invoke partisanship when they're in Congress, when they're speaking, and it has increased dramatically. The extent of incivility amongst elites has increased substantially. Of course, there's a huge Trump effect there as well. There's a paper that just came out that showed that people actually become more uncivil when they get positive feedback for being uncivil, and people are more likely to give positive feedback when there is incivility. So there's kind of this moral disengagement loop. There's a model called the MAD model, which I'm forgetting what the acronym stands for right now, that Bill Brady has kind of been involved with developing. So, and then the final point is, one of the things, so there's a big debate about the extent to which the public has ideologically polarized. And you know, I think the consensus is that they have not so much, although again, it depends who you talk to. But one thing that is not debated so much is that elites have ideologically polarized, right? If you look at roll call voting, particularly driven by Republicans becoming more and more to the right, and that has been shown to be causally related to the increase in animosity. So as elites become more ideologically polarized, people, especially sophisticated partisans who are aware of that, become more likely to have animosity. And yes, I think elites, and that works both ways. So they are causing the animosity, and I think they're certainly exploiting the animosity. And that's I think a very old strategy of partisan elites to try to exploit what they can to win, which is why I kind of said towards the end that, you know, I don't think we can rely on elites to necessarily kind of do what you know, to do what's in the national interest per se. Yes, we included leaners. I'm sorry, I never defined who was included. So everything I showed you, we excluded pure independents. We have them in our data.
we didn't look at them very much. We looked at them a little, but we included leaners as partisans. And so, so yeah, we counted them, and we didn't, it's actually a good question. We haven't looked at all for if leaners behave differently than non-leaners. We were just looking at animosity, but it's a good question that we could definitely look at. So that, thank you for that. Often extreme partisan behavior of political leadership and their felt need to respond to often extreme minority partisans, particularly since many come from safe districts where they can be primary by extreme partisans. Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly the concern, especially the decline of competitive districts, which is going to become even more and more rare coming this midterm. And so you end up with, you know, more and more extreme partisans. And I guess these midterms will be very telling insofar as kind of, you know, what these primaries are going to produce. And then, you know, we're probably, I don't think election day in 2022 is going to be particularly interesting, because I think the primaries are going to be producing a lot of who end up getting elected. And, you know, we might see a growing disconnect between, you know, moderates. Public is largely moderate. It's actually quite fascinating. There was a study that looked at positions on something like 20 different public policy issues across the world. I don't know, like 20 different countries. And the US was one, if not the second most moderate country across the world. So it's actually a country largely of people with moderate policy positions. And so I think that this point is a you know, a really good one. I mean, I think the midterm, which, you know, midterm studies will be particularly important to be doing, to kind of, because that's might be the basis of what we see in 2024 then. That's it for the questions on the chat. And I also see I've talked for a really long time by now. So
If there are any more questions in the room, but yeah, I think we should probably leave it there.
yeah, well, thank you for your patience. I know it was a lot, and so appreciate it. Great questions. So it's really helpful for us.
Really appreciate the stimulating talk. This is great.
Thanks everyone for being on the Zoom. This concludes our presentation today, and have a great day.